Boundaries. The one word that triggers a narcissist. The moment you say it, the air changes. Not loudly, not dramatically, but something shifts. It could be as simple as, "I'm not comfortable with that," or "I need some space," or the most dangerous sentence of all, "No." And suddenly, the person who once adored you, needed you, leaned on you, praised you, or depended on you, looks at you like you've just committed an unforgivable crime. Their tone hardens. Their warmth disappears. Their eyes go cold, confused, or furious. You didn't insult them. You didn't attack them. You didn't abandon them. You just set a boundary. And to a narcissist, that single word boundary is not neutral. It's not healthy. It's not reasonable. It's a threat. Because boundaries don't just limit behavior. They expose something far more dangerous to the narcissistic mind. The truth that they are not in control. For most people, boundaries are invisible lines of self-respect. They define where one person ends and another begins. They protect energy, time, emotions, and dignity. In healthy relationships, boundaries create safety, clarity, and trust. But to a narcissist, boundaries feel like rejection even when they aren't. They feel like punishment even when they're calm and respectful. They feel like cruelty even when they're necessary. Why? Because a narcissist doesn't experience relationships as partnerships. They experience them as extensions of themselves. Your attention regulates their self-worth. Your availability soothes their anxiety. Your emotional reactions confirm their importance. So when you introduce a boundary, you're not just changing a rule. You're disrupting their emotional supply system. Suddenly, they have to sit with discomfort they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Suddenly, they can't reach into you whenever they feel insecure, angry, lonely, or empty. Suddenly, they're forced to face something terrifying. Their feelings are their responsibility, and that is unbearable. This is why the reaction feels so disproportionate. Why a calm boundary is met with rage, guilt-tripping, silence, or dramatic victimhood. Why they accuse you of being selfish, cold, heartless, or changed. You didn't change. You stopped overgiving. Boundaries pull the narcissist out of their fantasy. The fantasy where other people exist to regulate their emotions, meet their needs, and absorb their pain. And when that fantasy cracks, their false sense of self starts to wobble. That's when the mask slips. That's when you see how deeply boundaries threaten them. And if you've ever walked away from a conversation shaking, doubting yourself, wondering why simply protecting your mental health caused so much chaos, this is why. You touched the one thing they cannot tolerate. A reminder that you are separate from them, that you have needs, limits, autonomy. And that scares them more than anything. Because boundaries don't destroy narcissistic relationships. They reveal them. If this is already resonating with you, make sure you subscribe to the channel. These conversations go deep not to shame, not to attack, but to help you understand what you've been living through, so you can finally stop blaming yourself and start reclaiming your power. Subscribing supports the channel and helps us continue creating honest, healing content like this. Before we continue, let me ask you a quick question. Think carefully before you answer. Question: when you set a boundary with a narcissistic person, what happens more often? A. They respect it, even if they don't like it. B. They react emotionally, defensively, or aggressively. Comment A or B below. Your answer might tell you more than you think. What a boundary really means, and why most people underestimate it. Most people think boundaries are about rules, about saying no, about drawing lines and enforcing consequences. They imagine boundaries as something rigid, confrontational, or even aggressive, something you do to other people when they've gone too far. But that misunderstanding is exactly why boundaries are so difficult to set and so easy to violate. A real boundary is not about controlling someone else's behavior. It's about clarifying your own relationship with yourself. At its core, a boundary is a statement of truth. It quietly answers one essential question: what am I responsible for? And what am I not? Your emotions are yours. Your time is yours. Your energy is yours. Your choices are yours. A boundary simply marks where your responsibility ends. That's it. And yet, most people drastically underestimate the power of that clarity because they were never taught that they're allowed to have it. Many of us grew up learning that love meant flexibility, that being easygoing made us good partners, good children, good friends. We learned to explain ourselves, justify our needs, soften our discomfort, and tolerate situations that quietly drained us because saying no felt selfish, dramatic, or ungrateful. So when we finally try to set a boundary, we don't do it with confidence. We do it with apology, with hesitation, with fear. We say things like, "I'm sorry, I just feel like," or "I don't want to cause problems, but," or "Maybe I'm wrong, but this makes me uncomfortable." And here's the painful truth. When you underestimate your boundary, other people will too. Especially people who benefit from you not having one. A boundary isn't a negotiation. It isn't a request for permission. It isn't an emotional essay designed to make someone understand your pain. A boundary is a declaration of self-respect. It doesn't need to be loud to be firm. It doesn't need to be angry to be real. It doesn't need to be justified to be valid. The reason boundaries feel so threatening to certain people isn't because they're cruel or unfair. It's because they remove access. They say, "You don't get unlimited entry into my inner world anymore." And that's a radical shift. When you begin to understand boundaries this way, something important changes. You stop trying to convince others to treat you better. You stop arguing your way into being respected. You stop chasing emotional resolution from people who have never offered it. Instead, you start asking a different question. What behavior am I willing to tolerate? And what behavior am I no longer available for? That question isn't about punishment. It's about alignment. Boundaries bring your actions back into alignment with your values. They prevent you from betraying yourself just to keep the peace. They help you recognize when your body is saying no, even if your mouth has learned to say yes. And this is why boundaries often feel uncomfortable at first, not because they're wrong, but because they expose how long you've lived without them. They reveal patterns you've normalized. They reveal relationships built on access rather than mutual respect. They reveal how often you've been available at your own expense. That realization can be sobering, even painful, but it's also liberating. Because once you understand what a boundary truly is, you stop seeing it as something you owe others an explanation for. You stop over-explaining. You stop defending your limits. You stop waiting for approval. You begin to understand that people who respect you don't need your boundaries to be dramatic. They feel them naturally. They adjust. They don't argue your reality. And people who react strongly to your boundaries are often reacting not to your tone, but to the loss of control they once had. A boundary doesn't change who you are. It reveals who others are when they no longer have unlimited access to you. And once you see that clearly, you can never unsee it. The hidden core. Low internal self-worth. At the center of narcissism, beneath the charm, the control, the defensiveness, the quiet rage, when boundaries appear, there is something far less obvious and far more fragile. Low internal self-worth. This is the part most people miss. From the outside, narcissists often look confident, self-assured, even dominant. They speak with certainty. They act as if they know who they are and what they deserve. But that image is not evidence of inner strength. It is evidence of protection. Because true self-worth doesn't need to be defended. Healthy self-worth is quiet. It doesn't collapse when challenged. It doesn't need constant reassurance. It doesn't panic when someone else says no. Narcissistic self-worth, on the other hand, is entirely conditional. It exists only when it is being reflected back by others. It depends on admiration, compliance, attention, validation, and access. Without those external mirrors, it begins to crack. That's why boundaries feel so threatening. When someone sets a boundary, they are no longer playing the role of mirror. They stop feeding the reflection. And suddenly, The narcissist is left alone with something they spend their entire lives trying not to face. A sense of emptiness, where self-worth should be. Low internal self-worth doesn't always show up as self-hatred. More often, it shows up as entitlement, as expectation, without effort, as a deep belief that the world should adapt to them in order to make them feel whole. Inside, there is a constant, exhausting tension. If I am not being affirmed, I might not exist. So, the narcissistic mind builds a solution. It builds a false self, a version of identity constructed from reactions rather than values, from dominance rather than self-trust, from image rather than substance. This false self becomes everything. It must be protected at all costs. And boundaries are dangerous because they don't attack the narcissist directly. They do something far worse. They withdraw participation. They say, "I am no longer organizing my behavior around your emotional needs." To someone with healthy self-worth, that statement may feel disappointing or uncomfortable but survivable. To someone whose sense of self is propped up by external regulation, it feels annihilating. This is why narcissists often respond to boundaries with disproportionate reactions. Anger that seems excessive, guilt-tripping that feels theatrical, cold withdrawal followed by sudden warmth, moral outrage that makes you question your reality. They are not reacting to the boundary itself. They are reacting to the internal collapse it triggers. Low internal self-worth cannot tolerate emotional independence in others. When you become self-directed, when you stop explaining, over-functioning, or chasing approval, it exposes a painful truth. You were never the problem. And that realization is intolerable for someone who needs to believe that control equals safety. This is also why narcissists struggle so deeply with accountability. Accountability requires a stable sense of self, one that can hold imperfection without falling apart. Without internal self-worth, any criticism feels like total rejection. Any limit feels like abandonment. Any disagreement feels like betrayal. So instead of integrating feedback, they externalize it. Instead of reflecting inward, they project outward. Instead of repairing, they dominate. It's not because they are incapable of insight. It's because insight threatens the structure they rely on to feel real. Understanding this doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does clarify it. And for those on the receiving end, this understanding can be profoundly freeing. Because once you see that the rage, manipulation, or emotional punishment is rooted in someone else's fragile inner world, you stop personalizing it. You stop believing that your boundary caused the damage. It didn't. The boundary simply revealed what was already there. And here's the most important part. Low internal self-worth is not healed by compliance. It is not healed by giving more, explaining better, or shrinking yourself to make someone else feel secure. It is only healed when the person chooses to build something internally rather than extract it externally. Your boundary doesn't break them. It just refuses to keep holding them together. Control as emotional oxygen. For a narcissist, control is not a preference. It is not a personality quirk. It is not even a strategy, chosen consciously. Control is oxygen. Without it, they don't merely feel uncomfortable, they feel as though they are suffocating. This is where many people misunderstand narcissistic behavior. They assume the need for control is about power, dominance, or ego gratification. In reality, control serves a far more basic psychological function. It stabilizes an inner world that feels chaotic, unsafe, and profoundly unstable. When someone lacks internal self-worth, they also lack internal regulation. They don't know how to soothe themselves, ground themselves, or tolerate uncertainty from the inside. So instead, they regulate externally through people. If they can control your emotions, your reactions, your availability, your choices, then their internal state feels calmer, predictable, manageable. Your compliance becomes their nervous system. This is why narcissists are often obsessed with subtle forms of influence rather than obvious domination. They don't just want you to obey, They want you to anticipate, to adjust without being asked, to sense their moods and respond before a word is spoken. That is control at its most efficient. When this system is working, the narcissist feels powerful. But more importantly, they feel safe. They know what to expect. They know how to extract reassurance. They know how to keep uncomfortable emotions at bay. Boundaries disrupt this entire mechanism. A boundary introduces unpredictability. It signals that you are no longer governed by their emotional gravity. It removes their ability to regulate themselves through you. And suddenly, the air thins. This is why boundaries often provoke panic rather than reflection. Panic looks like rage, or silent withdrawal, or sudden victimhood, or frantic attempts to pull you back into the old dynamic. It's not because the boundary is unreasonable. It's because the narcissist experiences it as a loss of emotional oxygen. When control slips, they are forced to confront emotions they do not know how to process. Anxiety, shame, helplessness, emptiness. These feelings are overwhelming because they were never learned, integrated, or soothed internally. So the narcissist scrambles to restore control, any control. They may try intimidation, raising their voice, making threats, asserting authority. They may try guilt, reminding you of everything they've done for you. They may try charm, becoming suddenly warm, attentive, apologetic. They may try confusion, shifting narratives, contradicting themselves, keeping you off balance. Each tactic serves the same purpose: re-establishing regulation through you. This is also why narcissists often escalate when boundaries are calmly enforced. Calmness is especially threatening because it removes emotional leverage. If you are not reactive, not defensive, not pleading or explaining, there is nothing for them to grip. Your steadiness deprives them of feedback, and deprivation feels dangerous. To someone with healthy emotional development, control is optional. They can tolerate not knowing what others will do. They can survive disappointment. They can regulate discomfort internally. But to a narcissist, lack of control feels like falling into free space. That's why they often describe boundary setters as cold, cruel, or selfish. Not because those words are accurate, but because the emotional experience feels that severe inside them. You are not taking something small away. You are taking away the system they use to breathe. Understanding this is crucial for one reason. It explains why boundaries must be consistent. Intermittent boundaries, ones you set and then retract under pressure, can actually deepen the narcissist's dependency on control. Each time they regain access, it reinforces the belief that control works, that pressure pays off, that persistence will restore oxygen. Consistency, on the other hand, forces a choice. Either the narcissist learns to develop internal regulation, or they seek control elsewhere. This is why many narcissists drift away once they realize control is truly gone. Not because they have grown, but because the environment no longer sustains them. And this is where boundary setters often feel confused. They wonder why someone who claimed to love them so intensely can disengage so abruptly. The answer is painful but clarifying. The attachment was not to you, but to the regulation you provided. Control was never about dominance over your life. It was about survival within theirs. When you understand control as emotional oxygen, you stop negotiating with someone who is gasping. You stop trying to convince them that the air is still there. And you begin to understand why holding your boundary isn't cruelty. It's simply choosing not to become someone else's life support system. Traditional versus covert narcissists. Same hatred, different reactions. Not all narcissists look the way people expect them to. Some are loud, arrogant, and openly domineering. Others are quiet, wounded, self-effacing, and endlessly misunderstood. One demands attention. The other seems to shrink from it. One intimidates. The other exhausts. But when it comes to boundaries, both react with the same internal fury. They just express it differently. This is one of the most dangerous misunderstandings people have about narcissism. They assume that the narcissist who explodes is the problem. while the one who collapses, withdraws, or plays the victim is simply sensitive or hurt. In reality, both are reacting to the same core injury, the loss of control and the exposure of a fragile self. Traditional narcissists hate boundaries because boundaries challenge their grandiosity. A boundary says, "You are not entitled to me." And entitlement is the scaffolding that holds their self-image together. When that structure cracks, their response is often immediate and forceful. Anger surfaces quickly. Voices rise. Blame is assigned. Threats, overt or subtle, appear. This type of narcissist externalizes their distress. They project it outward. If they feel diminished, someone else must be responsible. If they feel powerless, someone must be punished. So when you set a boundary, the traditional narcissist often tries to break it head-on. They argue. They dominate. They intimidate. They may accuse you of disrespect, betrayal, or disloyalty. The goal is simple: restore hierarchy. Covert narcissists, on the other hand, experience the same injury, but their response travels inward before it comes back out sideways. They don't attack the boundary directly. They attack themselves in a way that forces you to rescue them. Instead of rage, you may see despair. Instead of threats, you hear disappointment. Instead of shouting, there is silence, heavy with implication. They may withdraw emotionally, sulk, or present themselves as deeply wounded by your harshness. But make no mistake, the hatred for the boundary is just as intense. Because for the covert narcissist, a boundary doesn't just remove control, it confirms their deepest fear: that they are unlovable unless someone is constantly accommodating them. So they respond by creating guilt. They may frame your boundary as abandonment, or cruelty, or evidence that you don't care as much as they do. They may say things like, "I guess I just expect too much," or "I'll stop bothering you," or "I should have known better." These statements aren't vulnerability. They are manipulation, disguised as pain. Both types of narcissists experience boundaries as narcissistic injury, but they differ in how they attempt to heal that injury. The traditional narcissist tries to overpower it. The covert narcissist tries to emotionally entangle you in it. What unites them is this: neither is responding to your boundary as information. They are responding to it as a threat to their identity. Healthy people hear boundaries and adjust. Narcissistic personalities hear boundaries and interpret. They don't ask, "What does this person need?" They ask, "What does this say about my worth?" And that question is intolerable. This is why boundaries often reveal the narcissist's true structure faster than any argument ever could. You don't need to accuse them. You don't need to diagnose them. You don't need to explain yourself perfectly. Just hold the line. Watch how they respond. Do they attempt to negotiate respectfully? Or do they escalate emotionally? Do they take responsibility? Or do they collapse into self-pity or lash out in anger? Do they seek understanding? Or do they seek control through fear, guilt, or confusion? The reaction tells you everything. One of the most painful realizations for people who deal with covert narcissists is discovering that softness does not equal safety. Quiet does not equal healthy. Vulnerability does not always mean authenticity. Sometimes it is simply another route back to control. Understanding this distinction can free you from endless self-doubt. It helps you see that whether the narcissist yells or cries, whether they threaten or withdraw, the underlying issue is the same. They do not hate boundaries because boundaries are wrong. They hate boundaries because boundaries expose the truth they spend their lives avoiding: that other people are separate, autonomous, and not responsible for holding their identity together. And once you see that clearly, you stop trying to choose the right tone or the gentler approach. You realize the problem was never how you set the boundary. It was that you set one at all. Why your calm boundary feels like cruelty to them. One of the most confusing moments for people who begin setting boundaries is this: you finally speak calmly, clearly, without anger or insults. And somehow, that quiet firmness is received as an act of cruelty. You're not yelling. You're not attacking. You're not explaining endlessly. You're simply stating what you will and will not tolerate. And yet, the reaction you get feels wildly disproportionate. They look at you as if you've committed a betrayal. This is where many people begin to doubt themselves. They replay the conversation in their head, searching for a hidden sharp edge in their tone, a word that might have sounded cold, a facial expression that could have been misinterpreted. They ask themselves, was I too harsh? Was I unkind? Did I lack empathy? But the truth is far more unsettling and far more freeing. Your calm boundary feels cruel to a narcissistic personality, not because it is cruel, but because it removes something they depend on emotionally. For someone with a fragile internal sense of self, emotional intensity is reassurance. Reactions, whether positive or negative, confirm their relevance. Your explanations, your defenses, your visible guilt, even your frustration, all signal engagement. They say, you still matter enough to move me. A calm boundary says none of that. It says, I am steady without you. It says, I don't need to convince you. It says, your reaction does not define me. And that silence, especially when paired with composure, can feel annihilating. To them, calm does not register as maturity. It registers as withdrawal of supply. When you don't escalate, they can't escalate with you. When you don't defend yourself, they lose the battlefield. When you don't explain, they lose leverage. This is why calm boundaries often provoke more distress than emotional arguments ever did. Anger still engages them. Tears still engage them. Long explanations still engage them. Calm disengages. From their perspective, this disengagement feels like abandonment, not because you're leaving, but because you're no longer emotionally available in the way they expect. You're no longer organizing your behavior around their reactions. You're no longer centering their feelings over your own limits. To a narcissistic structure, that feels like rejection of the self. So they translate your boundary into moral language. They don't say, I feel unsafe without control. They say, you're being mean. They don't say, I'm terrified of losing influence. They say, you've changed. They don't say, I feel irrelevant. They say, you're cold now. This is not conscious manipulation in every case. Often, it's sincere confusion filtered through emotional immaturity. They genuinely cannot distinguish between cruelty and independence, because they learned early on that love equals accommodation. So when you stop accommodating, love feels gone. What's especially painful is that your calm boundary may come after years of over-explaining, over-giving, and emotional labor. To you, it represents growth. To them, it feels like punishment without warning. But growth often looks like cruelty to those who benefited from your lack of boundaries. This is why many people report that the moment they become calm, regulated, and consistent, the relationship deteriorates rapidly. The narcissistic individual may escalate emotionally, accuse you of being heartless, or attempt to provoke a reaction just to feel connected again. They are not responding to the content of your boundary. They are responding to the emotional shift underneath it. Your calm signals that something fundamental has changed. You are no longer managing their internal state. And that is intolerable for someone who relies on others to do that work for them. Understanding this can help you hold your ground without hardening your heart. You don't need to become cruel to be firm. You don't need to become loud to be heard. You don't need to justify your calm. Your steadiness is not violence. Your clarity is not abuse. Your boundary is not an attack. It is simply a declaration that your emotional life belongs to you. And if someone experiences that as cruelty, it says far more about their internal world than it ever will about your character. The guilt trap. How narcissists try to pull you back in. Once a boundary is set and held, something predictable happens beneath the surface. Guilt enters the room. Not ordinary guilt, the kind that signals you've done something wrong, but a heavy, confusing guilt that feels misplaced yet urgent. It arrives quietly at first, disguised as doubt. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I didn't explain enough. Maybe I should check on them. And before you realize it, that guilt begins tugging you back toward the very dynamic you tried to escape. This is not accidental. It is the guilt trap. For narcissistic personalities, guilt is one of the most effective tools for regaining control after boundaries disrupt the emotional ecosystem they depend on. When anger fails, when charm no longer works, guilt becomes the final rope thrown in your direction. And because many people who end up entangled with narcissists are conscientious, empathetic, and self-reflective, that rope often finds something to latch onto. The guilt trap works because it reframes your boundary as harm. Suddenly, your self-protection is rewritten as selfishness. Your distance becomes cruelty. Your silence becomes punishment. They don't say, "I miss the control I had." They say, "I don't recognize you anymore." They don't say, "I feel destabilized." They say, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me." Each statement is designed to provoke a specific internal reaction. Responsibility for their emotional state. This is where the trap tightens. You may notice how quickly the conversation shifts away from your original boundary. What started as a simple limit, "I'm not available for this anymore," turns into a moral trial. Are you a good person? Are you compassionate enough? Are you abandoning someone who's hurting? The focus is no longer on behavior or respect. It's on your character. And once your character is on the line, guilt does the rest. What makes this so powerful is that the guilt often feels sincere. They may cry. They may spiral. They may tell stories of loneliness, abandonment, or how everyone leaves them eventually. Sometimes they appear genuinely wounded. Sometimes they even convince themselves that you are the source of their pain. But here's the truth most people miss. Guilt is being used not to repair the relationship, but to restore access. If the goal were repair, there would be curiosity about your boundary. There would be reflection. There would be accountability. Instead, there is pressure, subtle or overt, for you to soften, explain, reassure, or return to the old pattern. The guilt trap thrives on one core belief you may carry. If someone is hurting, it must be my responsibility to fix it. Narcissistic dynamics exploit that belief relentlessly. They know that even when you intellectually understand what's happening, emotionally, you may still feel compelled to relieve their distress. That urge doesn't make you weak. It means you have empathy. But empathy without boundaries becomes self-erasure. So they wait. They let the silence stretch. They send a message that seems vulnerable enough to crack your resolve. "I guess I just don't matter to you. I hope you're happy now. I never would have done this to you." Each line is baited with implication. Come back and prove you're not the villain. What's especially destabilizing is how the guilt trap often follows a period of relative calm. You think the boundary has settled. You begin to feel lighter. And then the guilt appears, almost as if summoned by your relief. That timing is no coincidence. Your independence threatens the narrative where they are central, and you are responsive. The guilt trap exists to restore that narrative. Breaking free requires recognizing one hard truth. You are not responsible for regulating another adult's emotions, especially when those emotions arise from losing control over you. Feeling guilty does not mean you did something wrong. It means you stepped out of a role you were trained to play. You can feel compassion without compliance. You can acknowledge pain without absorbing blame. You can care without returning to captivity. The moment you refuse to soothe guilt that was never yours to carry, the trap begins to lose its power. And that is often the moment the dynamic changes permanently, because guilt was the last thread holding it together. Boundaries as mirrors. What they force narcissists to face. A boundary does not attack. It does not accuse. It does not explain or persuade. It simply stands. And that is precisely why it functions like a mirror, one that narcissists cannot bear to look into. When you set a boundary, you are not telling someone who they are. You are showing them where you end. Yet for a narcissistic personality, that line feels like a confrontation with something far more unsettling than rejection. It forces them to face themselves without distortion, without access, without control. And what they see reflected back is not power, not superiority, not importance, but absence. Boundaries reveal what narcissists spend their lives avoiding: their internal emptiness. As long as there are no boundaries, they can define themselves through others. They can feel significant because someone reacts. They can feel needed because someone explains. They can feel powerful because someone bends. The moment a boundary appears, all of that disappears. There is no emotional feedback loop, no reassurance, no reflection of importance coming back at them. Only silence, only distance, only reality. And reality is terrifying when your sense of self has always been outsourced. This is why boundaries provoke such intense reactions. They don't injure narcissists in the way insults do. They don't humiliate them publicly. They don't challenge them intellectually. They do something far more dangerous. They remove the external mirror that narcissists rely on to see themselves as whole. Without your engagement, they are left alone with their own thoughts, feelings, and insecurities, many of which have been buried for decades. Low self-worth, shame, fear of insignificance, fear of being ordinary, fear of being forgotten. Boundaries bring all of this to the surface without saying a word. This is why narcissists often respond to boundaries with rage, contempt, or despair. The boundary itself is neutral, but the reflection it creates is unbearable. What makes this dynamic especially confusing is that you may not be doing anything dramatic. You might simply say, "I'm not available for this conversation," or "I need space," or "that doesn't work for me." From a healthy perspective, these are basic acts of self-respect. From a narcissistic perspective, they feel like exposure, because boundaries make one thing unmistakably clear: you are separate from them. That separation shatters the illusion that others exist primarily to meet their emotional needs. It disrupts the belief that closeness equals control, that love equals access, that relationships exist to stabilize their inner world. The boundary says, "You are responsible for your feelings," and that message lands like a foreign language. In that moment, the narcissist is forced to confront questions they've avoided their entire life. Why do I feel so empty right now? Why does someone else's independence feel like abandonment? Why do I feel erased when I'm not being engaged with? Rather than explore those questions, most narcissists attack the mirror. They accuse you of changing. They rewrite history. They pathologize your boundary. They claim you're cold, selfish, or ungrateful. Not because any of those things are true, but because attacking you is easier than examining themselves. A boundary reflects back something they cannot tolerate: that their emotional survival has depended on violating the emotional autonomy of others. For you, the person setting the boundary, this can feel deeply destabilizing. You may wonder if you're being unfair. You may feel guilty for causing such visible distress. You may be tempted to soften the boundary just to restore peace. But what you're witnessing is not harm you've caused. It's discomfort they've avoided. Boundaries don't create narcissistic pain. They reveal it. And this is where the deepest shift happens. When you understand that your boundary is not an act of aggression, but an act of truth, you stop trying to manage their reaction. You stop negotiating your right to exist separately. You allow the mirror to remain in place, even when they refuse to look. Over time, this changes you. You begin to see that your worth does not depend on being reflected in someone else's approval. You begin to experience a quieter, steadier sense of self. And as that happens, The mirror no longer shakes when they push against it, because boundaries don't exist to punish anyone. They exist to reveal reality. And for someone who has lived in illusion, reality is the one thing they fear most. Why setting boundaries feels terrifying for you. Setting a boundary often feels far more frightening than enduring the pain that made the boundary necessary in the first place. You may know, intellectually, that you have a right to say no, to step back, to protect your time and emotional energy. And yet, when the moment comes, your body tightens, your chest feels heavy, your thoughts spiral. Fear rushes in before the words ever leave your mouth. That fear is not weakness, it is conditioning. When you've spent time in a relationship shaped by narcissistic dynamics, boundaries don't register as neutral acts of self-care. They feel like threats. Not to the other person, but to you. Somewhere along the way, your nervous system learned that asserting yourself leads to punishment, withdrawal, chaos, or emotional collapse. So even when you are safe now, your body remembers a different reality. You weren't taught that boundaries lead to respect. You were taught that boundaries lead to loss. Loss of connection, loss of approval, loss of peace. Many people who struggle with boundaries grew up learning that love was conditional. Affection came when you were accommodating, quiet, helpful, or self-sacrificing. When you expressed discomfort, you were told you were too sensitive. When you asked for space, you were accused of being ungrateful. Over time, your needs became something to hide, minimize, or apologize for. So when you consider setting a boundary now, an old internal alarm goes off. It tells you that you are about to do something dangerous, something selfish, something that might make you unlovable. That alarm doesn't care that you're an adult now. It doesn't care that the relationship has changed. It doesn't care that the boundary is reasonable. Its job is to protect you from perceived abandonment, even if that protection costs you your authenticity. This is why boundaries feel terrifying even when you know they're necessary. There is also the fear of becoming the bad one. In narcissistic relationships, blame is often subtly or overtly shifted onto you. You become the one who causes conflict simply by having limits. Over time, you internalize the belief that harmony is your responsibility, and that asserting yourself is an act of aggression. So when you imagine saying, "I'm not okay with this," you don't just fear the reaction. You fear the identity shift. You fear becoming someone who disappoints, upsets, or hurts others, even when those others have hurt you repeatedly. Another layer of fear comes from empathy. You can sense how deeply a boundary will unsettle the other person. You may anticipate their sadness, their anger, their panic, and because you've been trained to regulate their emotions, you feel responsible for preventing that distress even at your own expense. But here is the quiet truth beneath that fear. Boundaries don't make you cruel. They reveal who has been relying on your silence to stay comfortable. Still, the fear persists because boundaries require you to tolerate discomfort you were never allowed to tolerate before. Guilt, uncertainty, emotional distance. You may feel an almost irresistible urge to explain yourself, soften your words, or take the boundary back just to relieve that internal pressure. This is not because the boundary is wrong. It's because your system is learning something new. Setting boundaries means choosing long-term safety over short-term relief. It means allowing someone to be disappointed so that you don't have to keep betraying yourself. That choice can feel unbearable at first, especially if your sense of worth has been tied to being needed or approved of. There is also grief woven into this fear. Grief for the fantasy that if you just tried harder, explained better, or loved more, the relationship could become safe. A boundary forces you to confront reality instead of hope. And letting go of hope, especially misplaced hope, can feel like a kind of death. But here is what happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, when you keep your boundaries anyway. The fear peaks, and then it passes. Your body learns that you can survive someone else's discomfort. Your mind learns that guilt does not mean you're wrong. Your sense of self begins to stabilize around your values instead of someone else's reactions. Boundaries stop feeling like cliffs and start feeling like ground. And one day, you realize something profound. The terror you once felt was never about the boundary itself. It was about finally choosing yourself in a world that taught you not to. What happens after you hold the line? Holding a boundary doesn't feel like victory when it first happens. It feels quiet, uneasy, sometimes even anticlimactic. You brace for impact, for the explosion, for the emotional fallout you've been conditioned to expect, and then something subtler unfolds. The moment passes, you're still standing, and the world doesn't end. What happens next is not a single event, it's a process. At first, there is often escalation. When someone who relies on control realizes it no longer works, they may push harder. They may test the boundary repeatedly, pretending not to understand it, reframing it as confusion or concern. They may become louder, more emotional, or strangely affectionate. This phase can feel like proof that the boundary was a mistake. It isn't. It's proof that the boundary matters. A boundary exposes dynamics that were previously hidden by your compliance. When you stop bending, the relationship reveals its true shape. Then comes the emotional whiplash. You may feel proud one moment and deeply guilty the next. Relief may be followed by grief. You might miss the intensity, the familiarity, even the chaos. This doesn't mean you were wrong to set the boundary. It means your nervous system is recalibrating after living in a state of constant alertness. Calm can feel unfamiliar. When stress was once normal, over time, something remarkable begins to happen. The noise fades. If the other person is capable of respecting limits, the relationship shifts. Communication becomes clearer. Tension decreases. You start to feel more like yourself again. There may still be discomfort, but it is shared, negotiated, and survivable. Boundaries become part of the relationship rather than threats to it. But if the relationship was built on access, control, or emotional extraction, a different outcome emerges. The person may withdraw, sulk, retaliate, or disappear. This can feel devastating, especially if you've equated endurance with love. But this outcome carries an important truth. The connection was sustained by your self-erasure. Losing a relationship that cannot survive your boundaries is not a failure. It is a clarification. As you hold the line, your internal world begins to reorganize. You notice how much energy you once spent anticipating reactions, managing moods, and explaining yourself. That energy slowly returns to you. You begin to make decisions based on what feels right instead of what feels safest. Your thoughts become quieter. Your body becomes less tense. You may also notice an unexpected shift in how others treat you. People who are healthy feel more comfortable around someone who has clear limits. They know where they stand. They don't have to guess or test. Boundaries create trust, not through accommodation, but through consistency. At the same time, you may feel lonelier for a while. When you stop overgiving, you stop attracting people who feed on overgiving. The space they leave behind can feel empty. This is not emptiness, it is room. Room for relationships that don't require you to disappear. Another change happens internally, one that is easy to overlook, but deeply transformative. You begin to trust yourself. Each time you keep a boundary, even when it's uncomfortable, you send yourself a message. I will protect you. That message rewires old beliefs that said your needs were negotiable or dangerous. You start to recognize manipulation more quickly. Guilt trips land differently. Emotional storms feel less personal. You respond instead of react. And when someone tries to cross a line, your clarity arrives faster than your fear. This doesn't make you cold. It makes you grounded. Eventually, boundaries stop feeling like walls and start feeling like doors. They let in what nourishes you and keep out what harms you. You no longer need to justify them endlessly. because you are no longer trying to earn permission to exist as you are. The most profound change, however, is this. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You stop believing that love requires self-abandonment. You realize that peace is not boring. It's regulated. It's safe. It's sustainable. Holding the line doesn't make life perfect, but it makes it honest. And honesty, over time, becomes freedom. The deep truth: boundaries don't destroy relationships, they reveal them. There is a belief many people carry quietly, almost like a superstition. If I set boundaries, I will lose people. This belief is rarely questioned, because for many, it was learned early. Love felt conditional. Safety depended on compliance. Belonging required silence. So, boundaries came to feel dangerous, selfish, or cruel. But here is the deeper truth, one that changes everything once you truly see it. Boundaries do not destroy relationships. They expose them. A boundary is not an attack. It is not a punishment. It is not rejection. A boundary is a statement of reality. It says, "This is where I end. This is where you begin." And when that line is drawn, the relationship finally has to respond to truth instead of tolerance. Healthy relationships respond to boundaries with adjustment. There may be discomfort. Yes. There may be surprise. But there is curiosity. There is effort. There is respect. The relationship bends, stretches, and grows because it was never dependent on control to survive. Unhealthy relationships respond very differently. They react with outrage, guilt, fear, or collapse. Not because the boundary is wrong, but because the relationship was built on access without limits. When the boundary appears, the illusion breaks. And that is what feels like destruction. But it isn't. What's being destroyed is the fantasy that love required you to overextend, over-explain, or endure. What's being destroyed is the unspoken contract that said your needs came last. What's being destroyed is the role you were playing to keep the peace. Boundaries don't ruin real connection. They make false connection impossible. This is why boundaries are so confronting for people who rely on emotional control. A boundary removes their ability to define the relationship unilaterally. It forces equality. It forces accountability. It forces them to see you not as an extension of their needs, but as a separate human being with limits that exist independently of their desires. And separation, true separation, is intolerable for someone whose sense of self depends on external regulation. When you hold a boundary and the relationship collapses, it can feel like confirmation of your deepest fear. I was only loved when I gave everything. But in truth, what you are witnessing is not the death of love. It is the exposure of its absence. This realization can be devastating. Grief often follows clarity. You may mourn not just the person, but the version of the relationship you hoped it could become if you tried harder, waited longer, or explained yourself one more time. Boundaries end that bargaining phase. They bring finality to illusions. And yet, within that grief, something solid begins to form. You begin to understand that relationships worth keeping do not require you to disappear. You learn that connection does not have to be earned through self-sacrifice. You see that peace is not something you negotiate for, it's something you allow by refusing to abandon yourself. Boundaries are not walls meant to isolate you. They are structures that support intimacy. Without them, closeness collapses into enmeshment. With them, trust becomes possible because both people know where they stand. The irony is that many people fear boundaries because they think boundaries create distance. In reality, boundaries create safety, and safety is what allows real closeness to exist. When you no longer fear being consumed, you can choose connection freely. When you no longer fear retaliation, you can speak honestly. When you no longer fear abandonment, you stop begging for scraps of attention and start recognizing nourishment when it appears. This is the quiet power of boundaries. They don't announce themselves loudly. They don't demand validation. They simply stand. And in standing, they reveal who can meet you with respect and who never intended to. The ultimate transformation is not that others change, it's that you do. You stop asking, "How do I keep this relationship?" and start asking, "Is this relationship capable of meeting me where I am?" That question changes everything. Because once you understand that boundaries reveal rather than destroy, you stop fearing their consequences. You stop chasing approval. You stop mistaking endurance for love, and you begin building a life and relationships that can finally breathe. At the end of this story, the most important transformation does not belong to the narcissist. It belongs to the person who finally learned to stop abandoning themselves. Throughout the journey, the central character did what so many people do when faced with manipulation, emotional control, and unspoken pressure. They tried harder. They explained more clearly. They softened their needs. They waited for empathy to appear. They believed that if they could just be patient enough, loving enough, quiet enough, the relationship would stabilize. But instead of safety, they felt smaller. Instead of closeness, they felt exhausted. Instead of clarity, they felt confused. What ultimately changed everything was not confrontation, revenge, or dramatic closure. It was a boundary, calm, steady, and unapologetic. That boundary did something unexpected. It didn't create chaos. It created truth. It revealed which relationships were built on mutual respect and which were built on access. It exposed who could tolerate another human being's limits and who required limitless availability to feel secure. And in that revelation, the character faced a painful but liberating realization. Some connections survive only when one person disappears inside them. The lesson here is not that all difficult people are narcissists, nor that boundaries will magically fix every relationship. The deeper lesson is this: any relationship that collapses when you assert your humanity was never designed to hold it. Boundaries are not about controlling others. They are about ending the internal belief that love must be earned through self-erasure. When you set a boundary, you are not saying, "I don't care." You are saying, "I care enough about myself to stop betraying my own limits." That shift alone changes how you show up everywhere in relationships, at work, in friendships, and even in how you speak to yourself. Applying this lesson to real life starts small. It begins with noticing where you feel drained instead of nourished. It continues with pausing before explaining yourself excessively. It grows when you allow discomfort without rushing to fix it. And over time, it solidifies when you realize that peace is not something you negotiate for, it's something you protect. For the audience watching this, the invitation is not to label people, diagnose behaviors, or rewrite the past. The invitation is to ask one honest question: where have I been crossing my own boundaries to keep someone else comfortable? The answer to that question is often the doorway to healing. As a final note, it's important to remember that this video is for educational and reflective purposes only. It is meant to share insights, patterns, and personal growth concepts, not to replace professional psychological diagnosis or therapy. If you are experiencing emotional distress, trauma, or ongoing relationship harm, seeking support from a licensed mental health professional is strongly recommended. Before we close, here's a quick question for you. Which statement feels more true for you right now? Setting boundaries feels selfish, even when I know I need them. B. Setting boundaries feels scary, but I'm starting to see why they matter. Comment A or B below and let us know which one resonates most with you. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. What part of this story stood out to you? Have boundaries changed a relationship in your life, for better or worse? Share your perspective in the comments so others can learn from your experience. And if this content helped you see something more clearly today, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating thoughtful, meaningful videos that explore emotional growth, healing, and self-respect.